Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
It's your TV weather forecast for the next decade, next on Wyoming Chronicle. Winter comes early in Wyoming, but there's a certain denial reflex, at least while we're still out hunting. Even if it's a howling blizzard, we say it's fall. So while we kicked around the idea of a winter weather show at Wyoming Chronicle, we figured we probably should hold off until after Thanksgiving. Like Christmas advertisements, right? But we're shoveling snow at my house and winter is here. Yes, indeed. And this week, we're going to look at weather in a couple of ways. We're going to bring you a forecast, what to expect in the months ahead, and then we're going to bring you a long forecast, what to expect in the years, really in the decades, maybe the century ahead. But before we tread on the slippery ice of climate change and global warming, producer John Little got together with meteorologist Chris Jones to give you, well, a TV weatherman forecast that's a little different from anything you've seen before.
Predicting weather requires powerful computers and people who have many years of experience in the business. Sometimes, though, it's hard to take the weather seriously, especially when you watch a TV weatherman who makes a fluffy story. And that's the story from the field. Chris, back to you.
Thanks, John. Taking a look at the national map, out west, we have a 5% chance of major earthquakes in California, and that could cause some flight delays, and that could be bad. And turning our attention to the East Coast, we have a major hurricane working its way towards New England, and it could peel it off the map and blow it into Canada, and that could be bad. And taking a look at the rest of the country, we have some high pressure, some low pressure around. Undoubtedly, we'll be seeing some clouds and some thunderstorms from time to time. We'll be keeping an eye on a snowstorm or two, which, well, we're not exactly sure where that's going to move or how that's going to affect us, but be assured, folks, we'll be keeping an eye on it here in the Weather Center right here. No doubt.
Chris Jones, as you might guess, was not crushed by the high pressure of his job as a TV weatherman. He's not a TV personality, but is a meteorologist with the National Weather Service based in Riverton. Forecasting the weather must be some sort of mystical science. Tell me about forecasting weather. Is that an easy proposition? Is that a hard thing to do?
It's a challenge, and it's a constant. There's something going on every day in some part of your area. So we rely a lot on observations, both automated and human-based, but we're also trying to look at model forecasts and use our expertise to provide a 7-day forecast.
Tell me about the technology. What kinds of tools do you work with? Big computers, I imagine.
Yes, and contrary to popular belief, we have no longer a need for dartboards or dice. We have gotten rid of those. It's a difficult process, and it's not as easy as everybody thinks to get my high temperature exactly right at my location. But we take it personal in terms of a challenge. That's part of the fun. I think that's what invigorates a lot of us to do this job. In the last several decades, we've made progress to the point where a 3-day forecast now is as accurate as a 1-day forecast was then. So there's progress, and the models have a lot to do with that. The computers are vital to what we do, but the human intervention is vital. We could show you model forecasts that would say, oh my gosh, it's going to have rain day after day in this pattern, when we know that in westerly flow in the basins of Wyoming, we won't see a drop of rain in that flow. So the expertise at the local level still definitely comes into play. The computers can do so much, but we still think that's where our relevance is as local forecasters, is using that expertise and saying, yeah, but that's not what happens here. This is what happens there. We know that.
A beautiful sunny day can become a very stormy place in minutes.
I think as we look at, especially wintertime, we're talking about, usually we can see that the weather's going to have some kind of dramatic change, but we're looking for those 10s or 15 minutes things are going to change. In terms of preparedness, we're always telling people about staying abreast of the weather. So again, knowing who to call, and then having your vehicle prepped for winter. I have a winter safety kit, jumper cables, sand, extra non-perishable food items, extra medications.
Everybody wants to know, what is this year's winter going to be like?
We have arms of our agency, the Climate Prediction Center, that start to look out to a year. Should we see maybe some substantial snowpacks? Perhaps. I mean, that looks likely, but on the order of what we saw in 2010-11, no, because it's not as strong and it's not as persistent. So hopefully we won't be dealing with what we saw in the summer of 2011.
Chris Jones will tell you that the cutting edge of accurate forecasting at the National Weather Service is about 3 days ahead, in which case Derek Montague is way beyond that edge. Really, he's off the charts. He's a climatologist, and he's looking at long-term trends forward and back to the earliest records of temperature and precipitation, and really even farther back to prehistoric archaeological evidence of climate. And forward, trying to predict where the trends are pointing and what that will mean for the inhabitants of our planet. The problem Montague has, along with many others in his field, is that climate study is about much more than pure science these days. It's about politics and economics. Even if the scientists mostly agree, and they mostly do, that our climate is getting warmer and that greenhouse gases are partly to blame, there are powerful forces in the industrial world that fight against that diagnosis. Over the years, we've checked in with Derek Montague on a regular basis because he's no militant. He's a mild-mannered academic who listens to all sides, and in the end, he'll choose science. We got in touch recently because of a report out of the University of California. That report, funded by the climate change skeptics like the conservative Koch brothers, analyzed data to poke holes in global warming theory, and in the end, convinced its skeptical authors that the problem was real. Here's Derek Montague. So Derek Montague, we've gotten together occasionally to talk about climate change issues, and I think what prompts me to revisit this issue with you again is a recent report out of the University of California where a team led by a climate change skeptic sort of retried the data and went through it all again and then came out saying, well, in fact, it looks like there is climate change going on and it is in fact man-caused. So I guess I'd hoped you could bring us up to date on the science of climate change, where we are, what we know at this point.
Sure, do my best. Yeah, that study is an interesting one. It was performed by Richard Muller, who I believe is a physicist, not a climatologist, but like all good scientists, he entertains a skeptical attitude. Right. And because in the world of science we're always questioning what it is we think we know and how well we know what it is that we know. And I believe he was funded by Koch brothers.
They were in there. They were part of the funding, yeah. And very conservative pair of investors.
Right, yeah. Who are well known in the climate community as not, shall we say, accepting the consensus opinion within the world of climatology. And the brief, I understand, was to reevaluate the temperature data from the instrumental record over the last 150 years or so, from the global temperature record, and look to see how well it jibed with the temperature records that have been reconstructed by other organizations. And there are three in particular that independently provide those analyses. And interestingly enough, the result of that so-called BEST, best analysis, came out to support the analyses that had previously been done by the other people. Right. And so Muller, I believe, now has satisfied, if that's the right word, his skepticism, and now feels that that there were no inappropriate methods used in the other studies, and that indeed the temperature record shows that the global average surface temperature of the Earth has been increasing over the last 150 years, where we have the most extensive data sets, and that furthermore, that appears to be accelerating somewhat over the last 30 years.
Yeah.
And certainly also, if you then look into that, you see that the last decade of this century was the warmest decade ever, and the decade of the 90s, the last decade of the 20th century, was the second warmest, and so on as we go back over the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah. And if we look at this, I mean, we seem to still need a fair amount of convincing, at least in the United States, that this is in fact a scientifically based conclusion, that this warming trend is in effect. I guess I have to ask you, are there still skeptics in the science community about global warming that have real credibility?
There are a few. There are one or two scientists who are very reputable scientists, but their thinking is outside the mainstream of the climatological scientific community. One notable name that comes up is Richard Lindzen from MIT, and he has done some really good science, but he certainly is in a very small minority when it comes to what climatologists feel is the current best story that we have.
People in Wyoming will joke that, well, a degree or two warmer sounds pretty nice when we hit winter here, but it's obviously not about that. Let's talk about what the real issues are and the damage that could be done.
Okay. Yes, certainly the temperature increases that are projected sound very small. They're, over the last 150 years, it's been about 1 degree centigrade, about 1.8 degree Fahrenheit as a global average. We have to be a little bit careful there, though, because the word is average, and it doesn't mean to say that everyone's temperature has changed or will change in the future by just that small amount. There are certain locations on planet Earth where the temperature changes have been significantly higher, notably in the Arctic regions. So first of all, there's that issue that we need to be a little concerned with.
Yeah, and of course, those changes have all kinds of interesting effects that we're already seeing. One certainly would be the melting of ice,
yes,
in which so much of the world's water is held.
Yeah, there are a whole raft, of course, of different potential effects associated with temperature change. And oftentimes we tend to think of global climate change primarily in terms of a change in the temperature. But there may be other things like changes in precipitation patterns and amounts of precipitation, which are equally, if not more, potentially, the word damaging comes into my mind, but it's not quite the right word to use, but to have consequences, shall we say. But going back to the temperature changes that you've mentioned, the melting of ice seems to be somewhat of a canary in the coal mine situation, and it's been known now for some time that worldwide glaciers have been in retreat, significantly so. And here, even in Wyoming, we know that glaciers are in retreat, and there are people who think, say, that Schoolroom Glacier in the Wind Rivers is or is that in the Tetons? Now I can't remember.
Schoolroom, I think, is the Tetons.
Tetons, yeah. That's right, yeah. That's why I stopped myself.
Yeah. We've got Knife Point and a couple of others in the winds.
But Schoolroom Glacier and Gannett Glacier, which is in the Wind Rivers, are both in retreat, and there are people who think that Schoolroom Glacier will be gone by another 20, 25 years, something like that. And but that's seen worldwide, as I say, all the way from the Alps to New Zealand to other places in North America.
And we can talk about this globally, but when you look at Wyoming, there are a number of irrigators who depend on the late water flow from those glaciers for irrigation. And so, in fact, the impacts are very concrete. It's not just the pretty glacier is gone. it's affecting our actual patterns.
Absolutely, yeah. There are those examples in Wyoming. Globally, there are examples in other parts of the world. In northern India, for example, they rely heavily on meltwater from Himalayan glaciers, and people in Peru rely heavily on meltwater from the Andes, etc., etc. The other kind of ice, of course, that's melting is in the Arctic Ocean, and there Arctic sea ice has melted very rapidly in the last 10, 20, 30 years. And not only is the aerial extent of ice very much smaller than it used to be at the end of summer, but also it's realized that the thickness of the ice is now significantly reduced to about a half of what it used to be 50 odd years ago or so. This is a global problem, and it can only be dealt with on the global level. There's this sort of classic situation that's known as the tragedy of the commons, and where the atmosphere is an example, and it's a common resource. And the simplest sort of example is the overgrazing of lands back in the Middle Ages, where the yeoman farmer said, well, Joe's got a couple of extra cows out there on the common, I'm going to put another couple out as well. And then pretty soon everybody does this, and then you destroy the resource. And we seem to be somewhat trapped in that mindset ourselves at the moment. And so very often we hear people deflecting arguments about doing something here by raising the issue of what's going on, say, in China or India or whatever. But I think as a global society, we need to start to work together to get a handle on this particular potential problem.
You've talked about the long, slow process that would be required to gradually wean the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. I'm not putting that very well, but talk a little bit about that. In other words, if you want to slow or stop or reverse global warming and therefore restore or save the glaciers, seems to me you're up against that problem.
Yes, indeed. It's been recently realized that there's a sort of finite amount of carbon dioxide that can be put into the atmosphere if we're going to limit temperature rises. And it turns out that it's about 1 trillion tons of carbon in the form of carbon dioxide. And it's perhaps the most important metric for thinking about that. Now, that's to contain temperature rises to about 2 degrees centigrade, about 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, beyond which significant adverse effects are thought to kick in. Now, there is some level of uncertainty associated with that number because it rather depends on the sensitivity of the change in temperature to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but leaving that aside. Now, at the moment, we've throughout human civilization, we've introduced about 500 trillion, 500 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere. So we're about halfway there at the moment, which means we've only got another half a billion tons to go. And now one can sit down and start thinking about the amount of carbon that's still in the ground in the form of coal or oil or natural gas. And think about the rate at which we're introducing that stuff into the atmosphere, which is around about 10 billion tons a year, or close to it at the present time. There are indicators that that rate of emission is increasing somewhat, despite the discussions that have taken place over the last 20 odd years or so, suggesting that we should reduce that. But those numbers are continuing to increase. now.
Well, let's bring this back to the question of the glaciers and what it would take to stop their retreat or even begin rebuilding them, if that's the right word. I mean, is that even that's unthinkable, it would seem to me, in today's situation.
Yeah, I'm personally skeptical that it's going to be possible to see significant glacier advance.
Yeah.
We're stuck with the amount of carbon dioxide that we have in the atmosphere, and so that carbon dioxide is going to continue to increase temperatures somewhat.
Even if we were to stop
Even
adding,
if we stop
yeah.
right today, right at this moment in time. And of course, one of the problems is that as we continue to add more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we're getting closer and closer to our trillion-ton limit. Yeah. And that means that if and when we adopt any kind of mitigating strategy, those strategies have to be more intense, if that's the right word, and the rate at which we wean ourselves off of fossil fuels has to be correspondingly increased. Now, there may be people out there who are asking themselves the question, but wait a minute, why am I saying that carbon dioxide is going to hang around in the atmosphere that long? Isn't it being absorbed by the biosphere? Isn't it being absorbed by the oceans? And the answer is yes, it is. But unfortunately, the biosphere and the oceans both re-emit carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere again. All they do is allow carbon dioxide to be cycled through the biosphere and through the oceans. So their net effect on the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere is very small indeed. In fact, every year about half of the carbon dioxide that's emitted remains in the atmosphere, the other half being absorbed. Right. And what really controls how long carbon dioxide amounts are geological processes associated with sedimentation of carbonate materials in the oceans and the slow weathering of silicate rocks, which occur on tens of thousands of years timescales. And that's why it hangs around for so long, and that really underlies why I feel that the chances of seeing glaciers advance again in the future are pretty slim.
And I must say, it makes you a pessimist about our ability to even comprehend and deal with these issues because of the time scale.
Yeah,
our time scale is, our time on this earth, our 70, 80, 90 years maybe.
Yeah.
And you're talking about processes that are working in thousands and even millions of years.
Yes. Yes, that's absolutely right. I think that does kind of underlie that element of pessimism. On the other hand, I should say that I'm optimistic that as a human society, we can get our act together if we put our minds to it and start to grapple with these what are very difficult problems, I think, and so that we do manage to head off at the pass the worst consequences of inaction.
Wyoming, of course, has a huge stake in the global warming debate. We may have glaciers in retreat, but we also have huge reserves of coal, the energy resource that leaves one of the biggest carbon footprints on the planet. So while we'll continue to monitor the climate change debate on Wyoming Chronicle, we've also kept tabs on the huge effort to make coal clean, like our interview last year with geologist Ron Surdam about efforts to sequester carbon dioxide underground, and our conversation with Rob Wallace of GE about its Wyoming Clean Coal project, which incidentally is now on hold. We can't get every side of every argument on every show of Wyoming Chronicle, but we're going to bring you the thinkers, the decision makers, and the politicians, and we'll interview them in depth so you can decide. That's what you get every week. Make us a habit.